Good evening. Excuse me. Good evening. We've got to get the mic. Good evening, and welcome to the Ford Hall Forum. My name is Marvin Grossman, and I'm a member of the Forum's Board of Directors. Tonight's program promises to be an informative and exciting one. Assembled on this stage are three of our nation's most eminent historians and one of its most distinguished editors. We are proud to be co-sponsoring this panel discussion with Harper's Magazine, and I would like to thank Louis Lapham, our moderator this evening, and his staff at Harper's for their invaluable and continuing support. Our panelists tonight will focus attention on the lessons that can be gathered from the past and directed towards the future. At issue is what citizens need to know to be able to be effective participants in our democracy. What information do citizens need in order to be active, discerning members of their immediate community, their nation, and their world, and how can they acquire that information? The Forum has concerned itself with these questions since its founding in 1908. In fulfilling our commitment to serve the public, we ask ourselves, how can the Forum best provide access to the ideas and individuals who are shaping history? Why, when access to information can be had from a number of sources, do we feel it's important to preserve a stronghold for a public forum? To put it quite simply, it's because no other venue permits you to interact in person with individuals who are helping to shape the lives of millions of our citizens. Although the Ford Hall Forum is recognized as a cultural landmark, we can reflect proudly on the list of famous speakers who have brought their views here. Tonight, please consider becoming a member of the Forum or contributing what you can to ensure the continuity of our programming. We also request that you complete our audience surveys so that we are well informed on issues that are important to you. Our ushers at the back of the hall will be available at the end of the program to help you with memberships, accept your contributions, and collect your surveys. And now, on to this evening's speakers. It is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Louis Lapham. Educated at Yale and Cambridge, Mr. Lapham has been editor of Harper's since 1983. He received the 1995 National Magazine Award in the Essays and Criticism category for his monthly notebook column. Indeed, it was last May's notebook piece, Timelines, that served as the inspiration for this program. Host of the PBS program Bookmark from 1989 to 1991, Lapham is the author of 5 books, including Hotel America, Scenes in the Lobby of the Fin du Siècle. Over the past 3 years, Harper's Magazine has won more national awards than any other publication in America. It is with great pleasure that I introduce the person who has made this evening possible, Mr. Louis Lapham.
Delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to have this conversation with the eminent gentleman to my right. I don't think any of them need long introduction. Alan Brinkley is a professor of American history at Columbia University, and he has taught at MIT, at Harvard, and at Princeton. He writes voluminously for the literary press, and in 1983, he won a National Book Award for his book called Voices of Protest, Huey Long, Father Coughlin, and the Great Depression. Next to him is Mr. John Kenneth Galbraith, an extraordinarily eminent writer, very graceful writer. I've read many of his books, among them The Affluent Society and the New Industrial State. He served the Roosevelt administration, and he served as ambassador to India in the John Kennedy administration. And he has, as they say, written the book, or many books, on economics. Arthur Schlesinger won a Pulitzer Prize and a National Book Award. He's written a magnificent book on Jackson, which is one I've read more than once. And he was also a member of the Kennedy administration, and he won a number of prizes for a book called 1,000 Days, John F. Kennedy and the White House. And he is presently the Albert Schweitzer Professor Emeritus of the Humanities at the City University of New York. And I can't imagine any three gentlemen from whom I would rather hear on the evening's topic. The evening's topic is, why study history? What do we learn from it? What's the point? We've all heard the stories about the illiterate American public that knows little or nothing of its own history, about students who can't find California on a map or who don't know which came first, the Civil War or the Revolutionary War. But how does our ignorance damage us? History doesn't pay the grocer's bill. It doesn't settle the argument in the faculty lounge. It doesn't win the next election. Why then worry about it? Where is the purpose? Gibbon said that history is little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind. Hegel said that what experience and history teach us is that people in governments never have learned anything from history. So why then study? And I begin with Professor Brinkley.
Thank you. It's an act of hubris, I suppose, to talk about the importance of history sitting in Faneuil Hall, and perhaps even greater an act of hubris sitting next to Ken Galbraith and Arthur Schlesinger, who have done so much both to write history and to shape it. But this is a difficult question to answer, and perhaps for no one more difficult than for an historian. I cannot argue that history settles political debates or provides us a guide to the future or offers solutions to our social problems. But there is a paradox, I think, in the role that history plays in our world today. On the one hand, as Mr. Lapham has pointed out, both tonight and in a very eloquent essay he wrote in Harper's last January, the knowledge of history among our students and among our population is declining, and in many areas of American life is shockingly low. On the other hand, it may be that there have been few times in our history when history has been more visible in our public culture, more debated. Just think of some of the battles over history of the last few years. The battle over the National History Standards, the battle over the Enola Gay exhibit at the Smithsonian, the controversies surrounding the Columbian Quincentennial 4 years ago. And I could go on and on, not to mention the continuing and incessant battles over ethnic and racial histories and gender history. Clearly, somebody thinks history is important, and people fight over history because they think it exercises some power in our world. When I try to explain to students why I think it's worthwhile to study history, I tend to say three things. One is that I like to believe that history is important because it adds to the richness of our lives. It has an almost aesthetic value in the same way that literature does and any other of the humanities do. It deepens our understanding of the world. It helps us to feel that we're part of something larger than ourselves and our immediate surroundings. I also think, and although this is, I realize, controversial, that history is of value to many people because it validates their lives in some way. It helps them feel connected to a society from which they might otherwise feel disconnected. There's great controversy, of course, about the way in which various racial and ethnic and group histories have been presented in recent years, and that debate is a very important one. But I am not prepared to say that there is no value in the way in which individuals and groups retrieve their history as a way of retrieving something of themselves. But to me, at least, the most important reason to study history is the same reason that makes history so controversial and so much a source of conflict in our culture, and that is that history is, whether we like it or not, an instrument of power. In this presidential election, it's very clear that there are at least two histories that are being covertly and sometimes overtly debated. The history of the 1960s and the history of the World War II generation. Beyond that, we only need to think about our politics and our public life of the last generation to think of many other kinds of history that have been very powerful implements in the hands of many different groups of people. The history of the Vietnam War, the history of the Great Society, the history of World War II, the history of World War I, the history of slavery, and that's just in the relatively recent American past. All over the world, history is used constantly to validate, to delegitimize, to empower, to disempower. Otherwise, why would it be that so many authoritarian and totalitarian states have exerted so much energy and devoted so many resources to controlling their own histories, to airbrushing people in and out of history, to making sure that only an official and carefully controlled version of the past is presented to their public? History may not provide us definitive answers to anything, but history is all around us whether we like it or not. And our only defense against the way in which history is used by others is to have some knowledge of history ourselves. And that, to me, is, among many other reasons, a good enough reason by itself to value the study of history.
Ken?
I should like to mention in passing one point that Professor Brinkley started on and sloughed over. I don't see why we should have to find uses for history. Why can't we just enjoy it? It's extraordinarily interesting. Why do we have to find a purpose for everything we do? And therefore, why do we have to find a purpose for history? But on the other hand, I must say that I do have a strong feeling that there is an absolutely essential role of history in our public understanding, and particularly that we tend to attribute to legislative action, political action, to the everyday pressures of life, what can only be explained by the greater thrust of history. I began teaching at Harvard some years ago, 62 years ago last month to be exact. And at that time, the United States was primarily an agricultural country. Half of the gainfully employed were in agriculture, and many more were in agricultural local villages. That sort of society, that sort of economy, did not require Social Security, old age pensions. The old were looked after by the young. It didn't involve unemployment compensation, because there may be good times and bad times in a farm, but there's no unemployment. There was no great question of medical care, because the terrible fact was that doctors had very little to sell. It was only after the great historical thrust of medical education, surgical procedures, medical knowledge, that it became a fact, a terrible fact, that having money, having the ability to pay, made the difference between whether you lived or whether you were sick or whether you died. And thus the whole question was of medical care was thrust into the public domain, the public consciousness, by historical change in the medical profession. As Social Security, unemployment compensation, the whole thrust of of modern social legislation was in very substantial measure the consequence of the greater thrust of history. And there's a political consequence for this. The war that I never at the Ford Hall Forum digress into politics, so I'm being purely objective. The war that Newt Gingrich led, somebody called him Newty the other day, the war that Newt Gingrich and his colleagues led against liberal legislation was really, when you examine it, a war against history. And therefore you cannot fully understand this exercise in insanity unless you are conscious of the larger movement of history. And therefore, along with the enjoyment of history, you derive from history also the enjoyment of the embarrassment of those freshman Republicans.
Arthur?
Well, I agree with everything everyone has said so far. I agree with Ken that one of the beauties, delights of study of history is history's great fun. Anyone with any intellectual curiosity must be attracted by the idea of discovering how people lived in the past, how a structure like the one we are in tonight, what this must have been like at the time of the American Revolution, and so on. I mean, time travel is one of the favorite devices of science fiction. Well, time travel, in a way, is what history is all about. But I also agree with Alan that history does have certain secondary benefits. In a way, I suppose, history is to the nation what memory is to the individual. Individual deprived of memory becomes disoriented, doesn't know where he's been or where he's going. In the same way, a nation that denies or is ignorant of its own history becomes at the mercy of the present, the mercy of urgencies which lead, every generation feels itself peculiarly persecuted by history, singled out for woes that are much worse than any previous generation has had. I remember in the 60s hearing the self-pity of young people in the 60s who felt that they were peculiarly the subject of the persecution of history. And I thought of my own generation, which got out of college during a depression, with up to 20% of the labor force seeking jobs and not finding them, which in a few years found themselves in the greatest war in human history. And if one has knowledge of the past, one is able to put the crises of the present in better perspective. At the time, 1948, when the Soviet Union tried to stop passage into Berlin, there was great concern. George C. Marshall, who was the head of the Allied forces in the West in the Second World War, was then Secretary of State. And they had a rather tense meeting of the Marshal and the various undersecretaries and assistant secretaries. And one of them said, the very pessimistic reports were brought out of the dangers in the Berlin crisis. People thought of the wondered mobilization of forces and so on. And finally, some assistant secretary said, to George Marshall, said, General Marshall, I'm amazed. Here we are, possibly on the brink of the Third World War, facing a crisis like this. How can you be so calm? And General Marshall replied, I've seen worse. The fact that the history has been a record of vicissitude and crisis, provides a certain sense of perspective on the irritations of the present. I would add that though ignorance of history in the U.S. today, according to reliable reports, is deplorable. I heard the other day of a man who was lecturing in the Second World War, and a student came up to him afterwards and said, "Oh, he said, you were talking about the Second World War. What was the First World War?" And there are those who cannot locate chronologically when the Civil War took place, and so on. The recent 4th of July in New York, the Daily News sent a reporter out to Times Square to ask people why the 4th of July was being celebrated. They asked 40 people. Only 5 knew. Most of them were foreign tourists. Someone said, "Oh, I think that's," when asked why we were celebrating the 4th of July, one person said, "Oh, I think it's because that was the end of the Civil War." Another said, "Oh, wasn't that the Boston Tea Party?" A little closer, anyway. But there is also a danger, which historians sometimes ignore, of knowing too much history, of being obsessed with history to such a degree that history causes people to relive the horrors and grudges and feuds and so on of the past. Cases perhaps in the Balkans today, where the Battle of Kosovo in the 14th century still rankles in the hearts of many people in the Balkans. It's true in Ireland today, true in the Middle East today. For a long time it was true in the American South, where the Civil War caused abiding bitterness toward the damn Yankees from the North. So I think the knowledge of history is essential, but when obsession with the grievances of the past can cause great trouble in the present. But knowledge of history, apart from the inherent pleasure and fascination of the intellectual inquiry into the past, the knowledge of history does, I think, create a certain perspective about the problems of the present. It gives those who read history a certain diagnostic skill to know how seriously they should take what the newspapers present as some apocalyptic challenge. In other words, history makes us, it seems to me, knowledge of history makes us much more civilized people than we would be otherwise.
Well, then let me put a question to either of the three of you. Again, I agree with everything that's been said, but does it matter that now so much history is being processed into docudrama on television, or made into Disneyland versions of the Civil War, or is there, because there's a great deal of interest in history, I think, on television. I mean, there's a History Channel, there is the success of the Ken Burns films, and if that is Baudelarized or softened into some sort of Hallmark card version of American history, is that a danger? Does that matter? Is it something to be concerned about?
If I thought that television docudramas were believed by the people who saw them, it would be a danger. But fortunately, there are so many of them. Most of them are so awkward and unconvincing, and most of them, they present a confusing picture of the past that I think people take them with a grain of salt. There are movies that can be more harmful. I think the Oliver Stone movie JFK, with its implication or its argument that President Kennedy was murdered by a high government conspiracy, including his successor as President of the United States, top people in the Pentagon, the CIA, and so on. That seemed to me because of the skill with which it was presented, the simulation of what appeared to be newsreel shots and so on. That seemed to be a harmful kind of thing if anyone believed it, and I fear that some did. On the other hand, it's a free country, and just as Oliver Stone is free to make movies, so historians are free to criticize them. And on the whole, I think the Disney theme parks, so long as they don't spoil Civil War battlefields, might lead people on to a more serious and critical sense of the past.
But I wonder about that. I'm not a defender of television, television documentaries for a moment. But Arthur, the first motion picture I think I ever saw was Birth of a Nation. Have we ever had anything recently on television as historically corrupt as that was?
I don't see television enough to be able to answer that with confidence, but I'm sure that television has done worse than The Birth of a Nation.
I think the popularization of history is both a good and a bad thing. There's some very good historical popularization. Many of the serious historical documentaries of the last decade, Ken Burns are perhaps the best known, but there are many others on public television and elsewhere are really very good history. There, just as an example, there's a really superb portrait of Theodore Roosevelt airing on public television this weekend. And I think that brings history to more people than the Academy ever reaches, and I think that's of great value to us. I'm not terribly concerned about the sort of cheap and romanticized versions of history that appear in films and on television. I don't like them, but I don't think they do great harm. I can think of professional works of scholarship that are just as corrupt and distorting as the worst things on the Disney Channel. But I do think that the pervasiveness of history in popular culture is, among other things, a sign of the failure of the historical profession to make its own work accessible to people outside it. I mean, historians have almost entirely abdicated their role as contributors to popular discourse, and there certainly are exceptions, and two of them are sitting to my right, but on the whole, I think the historical profession writes for itself and has ceased to play any important role in the way citizens understand their history, except to the degree that historians perhaps write textbooks for students. And that, I think, is a loss both for the society and for the profession, and it has left a vacuum into which all of these other institutions and individuals, some of them good, some of them not, have moved.
I might just add that my critical remarks are addressed to docudramas on television, not to the documentaries. And I agree with Alan Brinkley that there have been some very fine documentaries, but documentaries are more or less based on history. Docudramas are based on fantasy.
But I had to write a documentary once, Arthur, and it was a 6-part series on the history of American foreign policy in the 20th century. And it's a very difficult form because you have so few words, and I had to, they gave me one set of photographs and another set of photographs, and I had exactly 1 minute and 40 seconds to get from one of those photographs to the other one and explain the origins of World War II. And so that when you actually get down to writing one of those scripts, like maybe you've done that, but it becomes of necessity extremely simplified. And again, you're under the constant siege of the present. I mean, we're besieged with images all the time, and on television or in the print media, and it's hard to ward them off and get the sense of time past and time future. I think. I mean, I saw an editorial, a headline this morning in the Times. The lead headline in the New York Times this morning is, Clinton says talk failed to resolve issues in Mideast. So, I mean, he had Netanyahu and Arafat there for 2 days and one lunch, and the argument has been going on for 3,000 years. And, you know, it somehow didn't get resolved yesterday over lunch at the White House. But it's that sort of an attitude that is, you know, I think maybe more pervasive than you do. But let me ask another question. What is the use of history to make the future? In other words, what else do we have to build or make or imagine the future unless it is the past? Is that not another way of...
Well, history never repeats itself in any accurate way. As the old joke used to go, history doesn't repeat itself, historians only repeat each other. There are limits to the value of historical analogy. As Mark Twain once said, a cat who jumps on a hot stove will never jump on a hot stove again. The trouble is he won't never jump on a cold stove either. Nonetheless, there are certain broad tendencies visible in the present which will project themselves into the future. I mean, it seems to me today that we are going through a shift as profound as the Industrial Revolution 2 centuries ago. That was a shift from a farm-based to a factory-based economy. We're now going through a shift from a factory-based to a computer-based economy. All this is going to have implications that will not be precisely comparable in any sense to what happened 2 centuries ago with the Industrial Revolution. But the sense of this kind of change, the impact on families, the impact on urbanization, the impact on so many things, all this does give a certain value. I think historians are no guarantee, being a PhD in history is no guarantee of supernatural wisdom in public affairs. After all, Newt Gingrich is a PhD in history. But I still think people with a knowledge of the past have a better chance to be able to anticipate some of the problems and benefits of the future.
I'd be much stronger than that, Arthur. I think, this is my experience quite seriously, that there is very little in economics that one can understand without some knowledge of the history of economic life and the history of economists and their interpretation of it. And there's a lot of that which informs the present. One example, going back to the tulip mania of the 17th century in Holland, and John Law in France at the beginning of the 18th century, and the South Sea bubble, and the long period of episodes of a speculative sort in the last century, on down, for example, to 1929, 1987. Unless one has examined that whole run of history, one cannot understand one of the basic features of modern financial life, which is the commitment to recurrent insanity, which is extremely important and may be somewhat relevant to what we see at the present time. A world in which we have far more money searching for profits in the stock market, far more money in mutual funds than there is intelligence to handle it. And therefore, it only becomes evident pressingly evident when one has gone over that history. So while I'm not a professional historian, it's my pride this evening to be much more strongly committed to history than you are.
I cannot say the same about economics.
There was, and for many years at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and I assume still is, a course called The Uses of History, and it was taught when I was at Harvard by Ernest May and Richard Neustadt. And the premise of that course was that there were ways to use history as a practical social science tool. That history could be studied by the case method in the same way that law and business were studied, and that out of it policymakers could learn ways in which to deal with social problems and public issues that would be practically useful to them. And I have no doubt that there are times in which history does have practical utility in providing answers to social, political, and economic problems. I think Professor Galbraith is absolutely right that in economics in particular, the historical behavior of an economy is an invaluable, if not necessarily always wisely understood, guide to the future performance of economies. On the other hand, I think there are many, perhaps most of the important issues before us for which history offers no concrete and practical guide to the future. But it does do something else.
What would be an example?
How to solve the problem of race in America, it seems to me, is a question that our history does not provide us an answer to. How to deal with the problems of urban poverty is not, I think, an issue that history gives us a reliable guide to understanding.
Agree with both of those things.
And there are many other problems all over the world for which history provides no real guide. But what history does do, I think, is provide something of a caution. Gibbon may have been right, at least in part, that history is a chronicle of failure and folly. But it's important, I think, for those who attempt to deal with great problems and to wield great power, to do so with some humility and some sense that answers concocted in a few days or months or even years in policy meetings might not work. And that's something, I think, if nothing else, that history teaches us.
Let me ask you, though, a question there, Alan. These two enormous problems, race and particularly the problems of the poor in the great cities, I agree with you that there's nothing one can draw on in history for a solution to those problems. But isn't that partly because there's not much history?
You mean there's not that much time has elapsed? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Well, there may be not much history to the particular problems of modern inner city neighborhoods, but there is a very long history, of course, to the problem of poverty and inequality, just as there's a very long history to the problem of racial injustice and a somewhat shorter but not inconsiderable history of efforts to solve the problems of racial injustice. I would not say that history offers nothing to efforts to deal with those problems, but it doesn't offer an answer. It offers a chronicle of past efforts that have failed and some that have at least marginally succeeded. But it also offers, I think, as I say, a lesson in humility, a lesson in how difficult it is to deal with the great problems of our time or any time, and a lesson in the necessity of looking skeptically even at our own most passionately held beliefs.
Well, in that context, let me ask another question, which is whether history is more central to the notion of the American democracy than it might be in a different society. For example, for many years, for centuries, the world, whether it was Rome or Greece or France under Louis XIV, was perfectly happy to accept poverty slavery and various forms of inequality, whereas the American premise tries to carry forward the adventure of both equality and liberty, which makes our story, it seems to me, is a very exciting and unique story. And is there any sense in which the study and knowledge of American history therefore becomes more important to us as Americans than it might to were we British or French or Russian?
Well, we must be said, Louis, that we tolerated slavery, for example, much longer than Britain, France, and the countries of Western Europe did. I think all countries, at least since the emergence of the nation state, have had a certain commitment to the beauties and glories of their own history. We have it perhaps to a special extent, because in a sense we are a nation whose roots do not go back into the medieval past. We are a nation which is both settled and settled diversely, so that history had a kind of special function of binding people together, of transforming newcomers into Americans, and that gave it perhaps a special cogency. In the sense that we could talk without laughing of a committee on un-American activities, where the notion of a committee on un-French activities or un-English activities or un-Danish activities would seem improbable. So I think that history has had, as I say, a role in giving our sense of national identity a coherence and a depth which countries which were much more based on ethnic homogeneity might have. But I think that the glorification of the past is something to which all peoples are given to. It makes them feel more important, to give them a sense of belonging to something. I don't think we're notably worse in that respect.
I didn't mean it as a criticism. I meant it as, was it more fundamental to us to work out the thread of the American narrative than it might be to some other, I mean, it wasn't a...
I might say as a personal note, that what you said about an Un-American Activities Committee strongly supports my experience that history is something to be enjoyed. Some 10, 20 years ago, through the Freedom of Information Act, I got my FBI file, which was about that thick. Every time I'd been up for some public post or other, there was an investigation. And I must tell you, Arthur, that history was the most enjoyable thing I ever read. And it was full of gems, one only that I cite. When I was up for some post in Washington early back in the New Deal years, the FBI, or just after, the FBI went to the chairman of the Department of Economics at Harvard, whose name will be on, I will not use, to ask him about my views. And he said, political views, and he said, Galbraith, he's very radical, but nothing like Franklin D. Roosevelt. That was one of the more enjoyable experiences of my life.
Arthur, did you enjoy reading your file?
Beg pardon?
I was asking Arthur whether he'd enjoyed reading his FBI file.
I particularly enjoyed one comment written in the inimitable handwriting of J. Edgar Hoover himself, where one of his subordinates had sent to him, this was in the early 1950s, a clipping reporting that I had said something critical about the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover scrawled on the margins of this report, I always thought, he wrote, that Schlesinger was a stinker.
Well, that's history, Alan, falling into that. Sorry.
Another comment I want to pursue this that I particularly enjoyed was a request by a distinguished senator from Indiana who established my loyalty after I had made some testimony that had brought down the stock market. And there was an enormous investigation, lasted days, and it came up with the most disappointing conclusion that that poor senator could ever had. It said, Galbraith is self-centered and arrogant, but evidently not disloyal.
Alan is too young to have had
Alan,
an
you don't
FBI
probably
file.
have a file.
If I do, I'm sure it's much thinner and much less interesting than yours.
Well, I now think we will turn, as is the custom at the Ford Hall Forum, to turn the microphone over to the members of the audience and ask for questions. And when you ask the question, address it to whichever member of the panel you wish to address it to.
I hope you're not doing that just to avoid more personal comment.
Not at all. You can answer all the questions with personal comment, Ken. All right.
If it's okay, all three panelists touched on it slightly, so it's to all three of them.
Well, it's
Mainly
easier
to
if you
Professor Brinkley, I think.
It's easier
though.
if you direct it to one of the
Okay, Professor
three.
Brinkley. In the October issue of the Atlantic Monthly, Connor Cruz O'Brien argues that Jefferson should be removed from the pantheon of American statesmen, primarily because his notes on the state of Virginia seriously bring into question the legitimacy of the Declaration of Independence, the phrase, all men are created equal. What is your take on removing Jefferson from the pantheon of American statesmen?
I think Roger Schlesinger can answer that question as well. I mean,
Well,
I'd like to hear both.
I want to know from
yeah.
the professor because
First, all right,
for
yeah.
history instruction, what would you say to your students at Columbia in terms of removing Jefferson from American history that way?
I did read O'Brien's article, and in fact heard him speak on this subject one evening a year or so ago at a dinner. And much of what he says about Jefferson is certainly true. I think he does not, he compares Jefferson, first of all, to the standards of our own time rather than to the standards of his. And he also compares Jefferson to a very small group of people who were his contemporaries whose relationship to slavery was different from his own. The most frequent comparison he makes is to George Washington, who freed his slaves upon his death, and Jefferson did not, except for a few of them whom O'Brien at least believes were his children. I don't think Jefferson's views on slavery are the basis for his position in the pantheon of our national heroes, and they certainly should cause us to look at him with some greater skepticism than perhaps we have. I certainly disagree with O'Brien that we should remove Jefferson from the pedestal because he was too radical. Although Jefferson certainly defended aspects of the French Revolution that now seem to us indefensible, it does seem to me that part of the greatness of Jefferson was his understanding of change in history and the understanding of the power of change and the importance of change. I think any historical figure can be knocked off his pedestal if we look too carefully at what he or she believed on some issues. And we should look carefully at that, but we should also recall the things that they did that deserve our respect, and Jefferson did many. So I think O'Brien's article is a very elegant and intelligent screed, but not a definitive or persuasive assessment of Jefferson's place in history.
What offended me about the O'Brien article was the sense he gave that he was some great iconoclast, revealing facts that had been suppressed for generations. In fact, there's nothing in the article that hasn't been well known. He further fell for this cliche invented by sociologists about the American civic religion, which I thought it was I'm no great admirer of Jefferson. I think in many respects Hamilton had a much stronger sense about both the direction of the economy and the role of government than Jefferson had. And as Leonard Levy and others have pointed out, Jefferson, while he was in theory a great champion of, say, freedom of the press, in practice was proposed to the governor of Pennsylvania on one occasion that Federalist papers should be prosecuted under the law of seditious libel. So as I say, I'm no worshiper of Jefferson, but I thought this was a third-rate piece by a man who doesn't know much of American history and who's well known for his egotism.
All right, the next question.
Hi, since you were speaking about your FBI files, and since I gather the topic tonight has something to do with democracy, this is a very interesting topic for me. I wonder if any of you gentlemen would care to comment on whether or not you are satisfied with the degree of control that we as a society have over agencies like the FBI, and whether or not you think in a genuine democracy there ought to be entities like the FBI engaged in investigations of citizens who have aren't being investigated for any criminal, possible criminal matter, but investigations which include, as Professor Galbraith mentioned, one's political beliefs. Even, and I would ask, even, is it appropriate, even in cases where people are interested in perhaps a job in the White House, is it appropriate to have the FBI scrutinizing people simply because a president would like to appoint them to a position in the White House? Thank you.
Ken, did you get that whole question? The question is the
Well, I think the whole episode of the loyalty program, for which we must hold Harry Truman, whom I otherwise admire, somewhat responsible, was one of the great aberrations of the post-war years. And that this caused a great deal of sorrow, a great deal of unhappiness, a great deal of damage to the morale of our public service, and was otherwise inappropriate in a democracy. It shouldn't have been done. And it enormously exaggerated the role of conspiracy in opposition to effective administration in the American public interest. So I think there's no real defense for it, and I would have no hesitation in condemning it, and that it was headed by an aged, mentally mellowed, inadequate old character like J. Edgar Hoover adds to one's sense of repugnance. I don't want to overstate this, but
the question, Ken, is it getting worse? I mean, has it become more invasive, the government? Has the government, the FBI,
Oh, no, we've moved on from that a lot. And we're much more sensible now than we were in the period of the early 40s. I don't think there's early 50s. I don't think there's any question about that. If either of my colleagues want to say a word for J. Edgar Hoover, why, of course,
I certainly don't want to say a word for J. Edgar Hoover. I'm not quite as sanguine as you are about the present state of the FBI and other investigatory agencies. I think The abuses, at least as far as we know, are certainly less than they were at their worst in the 50s, and in fact during much of J. Edgar Hoover's tenure, although who's to say what is happening without our knowledge. But I don't think that even though we do have much more public oversight of these agencies than we once did, I don't think we yet have enough, and I'm not sure how one establishes the kind of public oversight that one would need to prevent violations of civil liberties and at the same time preserve institutions whose purpose requires a certain level of secrecy. As for your question about FBI investigations of people nominated for public office, I think it is a truly lamentable feature of our public life that our cynicism about leaders is such that the public in effect demands these kinds of investigations of anyone appointed to any office before it becomes politically possible for them to win confirmation. I'm not sure it's the fault of the FBI that they're engaged in these investigations, but I do think in a healthier democracy we would have some less invasive way of vetting our public officials.
Next question. Thank you.
In
I make
1990,
Yeah.
further point. We're here in Boston, and I think it's well known, I hope it's well known, that this is a community that rendered strong support and deep affection for John F. Kennedy, which I certainly did. I was sought to be a loyal friend. I love Kennedy. But there could have been no error of JFK so great as on the day after his election, or within a week or so, continuing the appointment of J. Edgar Hoover and Allen Dulles, two of the most effective figures in modern public administration. We always had a wonderful expression. We always had a very accurate expression of the two Dulles brothers, dull, duller, and dullest.
In 1992, there was a massive reevaluation of Columbus and the Spanish conquest. And in 2020, there will be the celebration of the arrival of the Mayflower. Given that we know the Spanish as conquistadors and not our pilgrim forefathers as such. However, above that Indian's head and above that clock, you have the disembodied arm with the sword in it. That's the arm of Yahweh, which symbolizes the God-given right to conquest. I wonder if you could foresee any such massive reevaluation in 2020.
I think that if Columbus had known what was going to be said about him 500 years after his arrival on this continent, he would never have bothered to discover America. I think there's a lot of romanticism about the idyllic quality of life in America, allegedly destroyed by the coming of the white man. We now know, of course, that the Indians fought each other, that they did not practice, in every case, the best environmental practices. Many people contend that what happened in Central America to the great Mayan society was due to overplowing of land and other bad environmental practices. The Aztecs used to demand tribute of maidens each year from tribes under their domination, whom they then sacrificed in bloody ceremony. The reason why Cortez and his small band was able to overthrow Moctezuma was because of the support he had from the other tribes who'd been tyrannized by the Aztecs and who regarded Cortez as a liberator. And so I think these were violent times. They were violent on the side of the invader, and they were violent on the side of the people who were there. And I think you have to deal with it as something that's happened. I don't know whether you are suggesting that we should know that the white people should never have come to America or what. But
I'm just saying that right now we have in Salem a fixation on witches. At Plymouth Plantation, we have a fixation on something that's entirely Pacific. We have Disney's Squanto. I don't think there has been a real complex take on the material.
Well, we've got 20 years to work it out, right? At least. Okay, thank you.
I suspect the 2020 anniversary will not be as controversial as the 1992, just because the Mayflower did not wreak the kind of havoc, at least immediately, that Columbus did. But I think it's a perfectly legitimate part of historical inquiry to understand not just what we've traditionally understood about the achievements of English and other European settlers in America, but also the catastrophic results of that settlement on other peoples. I don't think either should entirely overshadow the other, but I think they're both a part of history and a legitimate part.
Hi. This is for any one of you. When you look today at how campaigns are structured and the kind of rhetoric that goes back and forth, does it sadden you a little bit as historians? Does it sadden you that historians of today documenting political life in the 80s and 90s just don't have the same kind of robust material that you gentlemen had to work with when you were working for the Kennedys? In other words, does it sadden you in a way that we've gone from ask not what your country can do for you to just don't do it?
Arthur, you've written on this subject. What?
I don't think there was ever a golden age of American politics.
Really? You really believe that?
From the very beginning, political campaigns dealt in not only in partisanship, but in reckless accusation, countercharges and countercharges. Indeed, for the press, for example, in the 19th century was far more irresponsible and reckless than it is today. On the other hand, there was, in other words, scurrility has been a constant characteristic of American political warfare. On the other hand, there was a kind of counterweight of serious discussion of issues. Consider, for example, the Federalist Papers. Federalist Papers were written by Hamilton and Madison with some help from John Jay. They were published 2 or 3 times a week in the New York newspaper. They were printed and reprinted up and down the whole, through the newly independent states. They were brought out in book form and sold an extraordinary number of copies. Now, when you compare the Federalist paper with the pap that exists in the op-ed page of the New York Times, to which we were all 3 of us, I fear, contributors, and you have a sense of something in decline. No one could get anything of much length of argument today into the New York Times, unless, of course, you're the Unabomber. I do think that what is obliterated, even in the 19th century, the great orators would come in the first part of the century, Clay or Webster, later people like Bryan or James G. Blaine, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson. People would drive from miles around to hear them. They'd feel cheated if the speech lasted for less than 2 hours. And you got in these speeches a rather considered discussion of issues on a certain intellectual plane. Modern communications has caused a great change in the attention span of Americans. Radio came along, and radio reduced the length of political speeches first to an hour, then to half an hour. Television came, reduced them to 15 minutes, and now they're too much of it is 15 seconds of sound bites. And I think that this has meant that the offsetting tradition, that is a tradition of serious discourse, which in a way balanced the traditional scurrility and invective of American politics, that has been much enfeebled by the changes in the system of communications.
Thank you.
Many years ago, George Steiner wrote an essay called The Archives of Eden, where he said that one of the great paradoxes about the United States is that, on the one hand, we have some of the greatest libraries and archives. We put enormous amount of resources into preserving the past, but we are also, in a sense, the United States of amnesia. We don't really care that much about the past at another level. What I wanted to ask about, American conservatism has led a major attack on things like the National Endowment for the Humanities, and I just got this article this week that says that 20,000 brittle books, 230,000 disintegrating newspaper pages, and 130,000 objects of archaeological, ethnographic, and historical importance will not be preserved this year because of the massive cutbacks in the budget. And I wanted you to maybe comment on the declining state of preservation in history and how the American right thinks about the past, because I think that's something that American conservatives have often prided themselves on, is this celebration of the past and saving the past. So if maybe you could have some reflections on that, and maybe what we could do to preserve some of these things that are literally turning into sawdust. Thank you.
Well, it's a curious paradox that the party that is claiming to offer us a bridge to the past is also the party that seems to have so little interest in doing anything to preserve the records of our past, as you've suggested. And I mean, this is obviously an issue of great sensitivity to historians, but I think it should also be of some concern to others. The defunding, both by the government and by private sector organizations, of efforts to preserve the historical record is, I think, for scholars at least, one of the great disasters of recent times. There are other worse disasters, of course, for society at large, but this is not unimportant. I don't think it's because Americans care less about their past than other people do. I think it's partly because Americans are so susceptible at the moment, as they have often been in our history, to the myth that government can do nothing right and therefore nothing government does should be funded. But whatever the reason, there is a terrible tragedy in progress in many of the nation's libraries and archives and historical societies and others, where our historical record is simply disintegrating into dust with no money to do anything about it.
That's the work of Newt Gingrich, I assume, Ken.
Well, I wish it were just Newt Gingrich. A lot of people have been complicit in this for a long time.
Yes.
I have a comment and then an unrelated question, so they won't come together. I would like to challenge your, I think, the overall panel assertion that the answers to race, prejudice, and poverty are not found in history. If we, the collective we, are not finding those answers, I would assume you're referring to the American citizens, and I would assume you're including both the oppressor and the oppressed. And in my experience, African American teachers, lawyers, historians are finding answers to race, prejudice, and poverty in our history, if only by the way it's been told. That's the comment. The question, when I was living in continental Europe, I recognized an unmatchable, spontaneous passion for history in my peers. And the only place I've found it matched in the United States is in New York City immigrant cab drivers. The only element I could find different in the culture of my peers and the culture of British youth, French youth, Italian youth is our lack of respect for oral history. That our peers tend not to ask the elder generations what our history is. And I'm wondering if you have any other possible reasons why I found this spontaneous passion outside of my country, but not here.
Louis, could you repeat the question?
The question is, when the young lady was in Europe, she came across an excited, passionate interest in history on the part of young Italians, young Frenchmen, young Englishmen. And why is there not an equivalent excitement in the United States among her peers about history? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
That's the question. Why are we, as Americans, young Americans, not as passionately consumed with the historical past as...
I'll add, I originally... go ahead.
Let me challenge slightly the assumption. On a limited focus, at least, I've, over my life, spent much of my time at two universities, both in the city of Cambridge. I've been at Harvard most of my life. I've been a member of the faculty, a fellow of Trinity College in Cambridge, England, for also much of my life. I have known both Harvard undergraduates and Cambridge undergraduates. And, you know, I don't want to seem to be pretentious, but I would greatly prefer the average Harvard undergraduate in his or her commitment to intellectual life in general, and history in particular, to the more frivolous attitudes of English undergraduates. From my limited experience, I'm slightly at odds with your basic proposition.
All right.
I perhaps have not spent as much time in Europe as you have, but I've spent a good deal of time there, and I don't think I have detected a notably greater passion in everyday life for history than one finds here. Certainly European societies, first of all, they have more history than we do to preserve, and the preservation of that history is in many parts of Europe a much higher priority than it seems to be in our nation, with our, at least until recently, sort of heedless willingness to destroy whatever stands in the way of the newest development. But as an intellectual proposition, I don't have any evidence of my own that would support your observation. That's not to say you're wrong, but I can't. I haven't sensed the same thing.
I should specify that.
Let me say for the record, since this goes to a wide audience, that I have every respect for Cambridge undergraduates too, and I don't want to seem to be at odds with students there.
Thank you.
And I'm going over next winter to give some lectures which will go far to correct the whole situation.
Yeah, I'd like the panel to address the question of the impact of the historical profession on not only the quality, but really the substance of public discourse. It's been addressed sort of glancingly along the way. So I'd like to begin with some words of faint praise. I want to say the American historical profession has certainly done a much better job of that than their colleagues in Japan, where textbooks still describe the invasion of China as the advance into China, and where the Nanking Massacre apparently didn't exist. But when I look around at issues that have become controversial in the public discourse, it seems to me that disciplines other than the historical profession have done a much better job of sort of speaking with a corporate voice and saying, these things are nonsense, and these things we can actually tell you about. When the bell curve came out and caused a lot of controversy, the one on the heritability of IQ and what this allegedly tells us, I think the top 60 psychometricians came out with a joint statement, which was published in the Wall Street Journal, 16 points, what we do and what we don't know about intelligence, what it is, the heritability. Whenever a politician comes out with a new sweeping fiscal policy, you can pretty much count on getting some kind of statement in the elite media by, n dozen economists, of whom, 1 dozen will be Nobel winners, saying, is this nonsense or is this not? In contrast, I don't see anything coming out of the historical profession like that. During the Enola Gay controversy in the Smithsonian, when Gingras is running around saying no government program has ever worked, so just shut it down. What the hell? Even during the latest welfare or immigration bills, I haven't seen any sort of consensus statements by a panel of historians saying this is what we know, this is what we don't know, this is the consensus. This really should be sort of the framework for public discourse. And I guess I'm asking, from your point of view, why do you think that is? And, what could be done within the historical profession to try to redress what I, as a political scientist candidate myself, see as a fairly grievous shortcoming?
Could you repeat the question?
The question is, why is there no consensus of historians when a controversial subject comes up in the political discourse? Why can't we have a consensus view in the way we might get from mathematicians or geologists as to whether this subject is true or false?
No, I'm not saying consensus. I'm saying at least a statement by a group of people within the profession
not a
as to what we do know and what we don't.
But an official statement.
Yeah.
History is not an exact science. History does not even aspire to the kind of objectivity that science, until at least epistemologically unsophisticated science, thought it was able to attain. History, as the great Dutch historian Peter Hale said, is an argument without end. And it's very valuable that it should be so. I think any official or consensus or orthodoxy about the past is, in the main, a bad situation. When I think of the way American history has been revised in my own lifetime as a consequence of 2 great revolutions, the women's rights revolution and the racial justice revolution, and which has forced historians to look back into the past and see things that were always there, but they were not interested in before, and therefore they've revised and rewritten American history. Oscar Wilde once said, "The one duty we owe to history is to rewrite it." And I would be very unhappy if historians ever became concerned if there was such a thing as definitive history. Anyone who talks about a definitive history or definitive biography doesn't understand, in my judgment, the historical enterprise.
Well, wouldn't you just take that step further, Arthur, that in the past when we have reached something like a consensus on the need to prohibit the sale of alcohol, for example, or on the basic proposition that women's place was in the home. Or one could cite many other examples of whether there has been something approaching a consensus. We have almost invariably found it disastrous.
There are a few exceptions. Well, the abolition of slavery is one of them. But on the whole, what Kenneth Galbraith said is right. There's great danger. I mean, there are a few issues like slavery and torture which so deeply offend any civilized conception of human rights that there can be unanimity on the part of historians. But anything less than that, unanimity is to be regarded with suspicion.
If I understood the question, I think it was slightly different from what we've been talking about, which is why is it not more frequently the case that socially or politically committed historians don't use what they know to try to influence public discourse in the way that economists and political scientists and psychologists and others often try to do? I think what Arthur said is partly an explanation for that history doesn't have a sense of itself, and maybe more importantly, is not regarded by others as having scientific legitimacy in the way that economists are at least thought to have. And no offense.
Don't
so,
carry that point too far.
I won't. But I think part of the reason that there aren't more full-page ads in the New York Times signed by 60 historians talking about this or that issue is that basically there's no market for our views in the same way that there is for economists. But there are, however, historians who do attempt to play a role in public discourse and do attempt to influence public debate, and I think that's a legitimate role, and I've tried occasionally to play it myself. But I don't think that the historical profession as a whole either thinks of itself as or is thought by others as having the kind of scientific legitimacy that makes it possible for other professions to weigh in so effectively on some of these issues.
But isn't that to some extent, Alan, a virtue of history, that it attempts to take into consideration a much larger number of variables with a controlling role or an important role? That history cannot be narrowly on economics, it cannot be narrowly on sociology, it cannot be narrowly on science. It has to spread itself over a much larger number of controlling forces, and having that necessity, it is much less likely to come up with something that can be committed belief.
Well, I think that's right. History is a much more integrative discipline than almost any others that we could think of, and it draws from almost every other discipline in some way, and it produces a much wider range of approaches and results. There's no canon in history. There's no single methodology or theory or even any group of methodologies and theories that one could list in an evening that would encompass the different things that historians do. On the other hand, that doesn't seem to me to be a reason that historians should play no role in public life and in public discourse. I think they should play a role. I think that role will necessarily be different from the role that economists and scientists and others play. But there is still a role for historians. I don't think very many of us play it effectively enough.
Thank you. That was my question.
I'm going to ask the other people waiting to ask questions to be as brief as possible because we only have about 6 minutes left. So.
Okay, I'll try to. Well, this is a response to, this is a follow-up question actually from the previous lady's question. It's a response to John Kenneth Galbraith saying there's very little history about issues such as race relations and poverty. And I was wondering, do you think this is because history, which according to Alan Brinkley can be used as an instrument of power, is recorded and interpreted by members of the dominant power structure who are more interested in high politics and as such? And if so, do you think that this is a serious liability of the historical profession? Is it being addressed? And is it also giving us a narrow outlook on the past?
That's an enormous question, which I couldn't even begin to know how to repeat that one. The question is history being used for political purposes? Is that your question?
Well, my question is it that, and also that the historians themselves who are interpreters of this history, they're the ones who are part of the dominant power structure, and that's why there's very little history on race relations, poverty, etc.
Are historians agents of imperial power? Is that the question?
Kind of.
The question is, are you, as an historian, the agent of imperial power?
Well,
I'm simplifying in the interest of time.
I mean, there's an old cliche that is still used very often, which is history is written by the winners. And through most of history, that has been true of the history that has survived and that we know. That the victors write the history and disseminate it, and the vanquished may write history, but nobody reads it and nobody knows it. I think that is less true today in the United States and through most of the world where there is a formal organized historical profession than it probably has ever been before. And there are more voices alive and active and powerful in at least the academic telling of history, and I think also in the popular telling of history, than has ever been true in the past. Does that mean that all groups are equally powerful? Certainly not. But there has been I mean, the great revolution in historical scholarship of the last generation has been precisely a reaction to the perception that you've just voiced, that history has for too long been dominated by a ruling class that tells its own story and no one else's.
Thank you.
Throughout the talk, often the gentleman on the podium used the word history is, and that gave me, or us perhaps, an impression that history was a body of facts. Now, much of that you have recently, during the last minutes, explained that history is a very complex thing. And my view of history, and I'm not sure this is a question whether you would agree, it really falls into two parts for the historians.
Try to be brief. We're running out of time.
It runs into two parts. One is to what facts to look for, and each historian would look at a different body of facts, another this or that place. And then after he has selected, or he or she has selected certain facts, then the interpretation also kicks in, which may differ. If you look at a bunch of facts, you may differ among each other. Do you have any response to that, or is it too vague a statement, a question?
The question is, first, how do you decide which facts are important, and do you then making the interpretation of those facts, is that an entirely separate procedure?
All writing of history involves selection out of the chaos of the past. Selection implies some criterion, conscious or unconscious, of interpretation. And so that all history in that sense has a large area of subjectivity in it. Historians are not, on the whole, as methodologically self-conscious as perhaps they should be. So they really approach it less in the mood of a scientist conducting experiments than of a doctor making a diagnosis.
Thank you. Yes.
According to your definition of democracy, or anyone's definition, the United States probably hasn't been a democratic state in the full sense of the word. And the only past model of democracy has been in Athens. And I was wondering, with the advent of technology, do you think that we could is it feasible to change our representative system into a direct democracy?
I'm afraid I missed that completely. Did you get that, Arthur? I don't. What's the last part of it? I mean, there was a democracy in Athens. Did you get it, Alan? Okay.
Could we be a direct democracy?
That's all right. Alan's got it. Yeah.
The question was a statement first that America has never been a true democracy, and that perhaps the only example of a true democracy was ancient Athens. And is there some way that we could build into our society some of the features that made it possible for a democracy to exist in that way in Athens?
Well,
we could reinstate slavery, which is a characteristic of Athenian democracy.
Thank you.
I'm not an expert on Athenian history, but there were certain defects in that democracy, weren't there?
Slavery was one of them.
Slavery was leading.
Slavery was not entirely a benign institution.
I think, though, that probably what was behind that question was, is there a way to introduce into American life some feature that is more like the kind of direct democracy that at least those privileged to exercise it in Athens were able to exercise? And I think probably not very effectively. I don't know how many citizens there were in Athens, but they could fit in a theater. And we live in a nation of 250 million people. At the local level, yes, there are institutions that allow people a kind of direct access to power. Not enough of them, certainly, but some. At the national level, I think that would be very difficult, and I don't think we will ever and perhaps should never be a pure democracy. We could be more democratic than we are, certainly. But
Thank you.
This is specifically for Mr. Galbraith. I was wondering, there's a continuation and a progression of a mixed economy in the United States, and whether or not you think that that type of government intervention has or will ever interfere with true democracy?
The question is, can we continue with a mixed economy in the United States, and will that interfere with our practice of democracy?
What's that?
Can we continue with a mixed economy in the United States and at the same time preserve and maintain the political democracy?
Oh, sure. There's no alternative. We have to have a role for government, for the state. We have to have a role for the market system. There's no alternative now. And there's nothing that I see that as being in no way inconsistent with democracy. The only important thing is that we decide the role of the public services on humane grounds and not by doctrine, that we not be controlled by ideology rather than by thought, which we are to some extent now. Also, I would like to see the democracy somewhat more pervasive, more comprehensive than it is at the present time. If the people in our central cities, the people who are poor, were voting, we would have far more politicians out in this election, including perhaps the presidential candidates, making a case for the impoverished than is now the case, knowing that they won't vote. Bob Dole and his staff are now engaged in a bitter debate, I read in the New York Times, over whether they will campaign in California. There's no debate, none whatever, about their campaigning in Roxbury or the South Bronx.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have the feeling that one of the good things that history can do for us is to provide us with heroes. And I don't know that there's been much of an effort in that direction. But by heroes, I mean people who in one way or another can serve as models for us or provide some kind of guidance for us. And I wondered whether each of the panelists might recommend a particular hero to us and the reason for that recommendation.
Well, Arthur has written books about several of them, so.
Well, I think the one great hero in American political history is, the greatest is, of course, Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln was great because of his capacity both on the practical level to fight and win a bitter civil war, and at the same time to hold himself, in a certain sense, above the battle that he had to fight, in the way of pronouncing moral, self-righteous moral judgments on situations. I think Lincoln is the most impressive of our presidents.
When you speak of heroic figures in American history, how would you compare Lincoln and Roosevelt?
Roosevelt was another great figure. He saw the country through the worst depression in our history and the worst war in our history. But I think he, with all his qualities of leadership and daring and eloquence, he did not have a sense of the moral intensity that you find in Lincoln.
Last question.
Alan?
Yes, this is a question for Professor Brinkley and Professor Schlesinger. Both of you have written extensively on reform in America and reform movements. And my question is, sort of in our conservative era, do you foresee, is it inevitable that we will have another reform movement in the future? And through your study of history, can you just give some thoughts on the shape of a reform movement which sort of may emerge out of this period of conservatism?
The question is that you and I have both written extensively about reform, and in our present era, do we foresee another age of reform? Do we think it is inevitable, and what form might it take? Arthur has written much more extensively about this issue than I have, but I'll just say briefly, I don't think anything is inevitable in history. Assuming that our nation survives over some considerable period of time, I have no doubt that at some point there will be another period of reform. I have no idea what form it will take. I don't see very much evidence at this moment that time is near, but although as much as I would like to believe otherwise.
The great virtue of democracy is its capacity for self-correction. Sometimes it takes a little while for the combination of complacency that has to be overcome and the leadership to overcome that complacency. But I think the nature of the problems that we confront as a society will force a movement toward reform as a means of solution. I still have confidence that in the long run, democracy's capacity for self-correction will remedy some of our worst troubles.
Thank you.
Well, with that, we'd like to close the proceedings, and I'd like to, first of all, thank everybody on the panel. I thought it was marvelous listening to Mr. Schlesinger. And as the moderator, I'd like to have my own last defense of history, which is a quotation from G.K. Chesterton, who said that the knowledge of the past and the study of history is the best defense against the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking around. Thank you.
We at the Ford Hall would like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us tonight, and of course to again thank our panelists for bringing us this remarkable program. We would like to invite you to join us for the rest of the fall season. Our next program takes place Sunday, October 20th at 7 p.m. at Blackman Auditorium on the Northeastern Campus. Rebecca Walker, co-founder of the Third Wave Direct Action Corporation, will talk about the fresh concerns of a new generation of feminists. The next speaker at Faneuil Hall will be Ralph Reed, speaking on October 24th about the role of religious conservatives in the context of American electoral politics. Thank you and good night.